Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Scott from WCBS News Radio 880. Thank you for joining us for this Facebook Live chat with Jimmy Vielkind, the Albany Bureau Chief at Politico, New York. We're here at the beautiful Adorama Live Theater in Soho, coming to you live. And Jimmy is actually just off the train from the Democratic Convention in Philadelphia. Jimmy, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
Let's start with last night. Hillary Clinton's acceptance speech. Did she deliver what she needed to deliver?
Well, what struck me the most about her speech was that it, of course, touched on all the policy areas that a Democratic nominee would be expected to touch on. But what struck me was her explicit appeal across the aisle to moderate Republicans, Republican voters who might not normally be coming into the Democratic camp, but who this year, because of the rise of the populist Donald Trump, could be a Democratic constituency. So several times Secretary Clinton talked about how she will be a president for all voters, those who support her and those who don't. She made reference to former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, who made an explicit pitch to those voters on Thursday night. It was sort of on Wednesday night. People said it was sort of a triple punch. You had Vice President Joe Biden, President Barack Obama, and former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg talking about that. And of course, she did nod to the own history that she was making, being the first woman to ever receive a major party nomination for the presidency. I think that is something we've heard about in her campaign. I suspect it will be something we will hear more about. And you know, I thought she did a good job. She's not known as a great orator. I don't think that there were any really memorable lines in that speech. She's certainly, I think, it certainly won't go down as one of the greatest speeches in American political rhetoric, but I thought she hit all the necessary notes. And again, I was struck by that sort of the overtures and the bridges she was presenting.
The convention got off to a little bit of a bumpy start. You had the DNC email mess that cost Debbie Wasserman Schultz her job, uncertainty about what the Sanders supporters would do at the convention. Were they able to put all that behind them and end on a high note?
There were some errant demonstrators in the hall on Thursday night, but at least speaking for the New York delegation, which I was watching throughout the course of the week, there was a pretty solid contingent for Senator Sanders. You know, Secretary Clinton won New York and she won the primary handily, but that still meant that about 40% of the delegates going to Philadelphia were Senator Sanders supporters. And that was interesting. It made for an interesting dynamic because these are not people who normally fit into the traditional party structure in the state, which is really built around Andrew Cuomo, and he's tried to mold the party in a very centrist fashion since he became governor in 2010. But I think that many of those Sanders delegates kind of took a deep breath and, you know, fell in line for Secretary Clinton. I talked to several of them. One was former State Senator Tom Duane, who said that he was ready to do what was necessary. And many delegates, both Clinton and Sanders, said, you know, because New York was very solidly for Hillary Clinton in 2008. Our entire party structure lined up with her. And when Barack Obama bested Hillary Clinton in the 2008 Democratic primaries, these delegates are saying, you know, we all fell in line, and they sort of had the approach of a parent watching a hormonal adolescent, like, yes, okay, rage, bang your head against the wall, we get it, but, you know, come on, it's time to go forward. And I think that seemed to show on Thursday night. There were demonstrations, they were not mass demonstrations. There were some theatrics during Secretary Clinton's speech, but they didn't rise to the level of disrupting and really kind of showing on primetime television. You know, you could see from home that there were chants of Hillary, Hillary, kind of drowning out Sanders supporters or others who were considering and trying, I think, to say no more wars when Secretary Clinton talked about foreign policy. So I think that the party moves forward in a pretty good place, and several officials, both in New York and elsewhere, have said as much.
You are the Albany Bureau Chief at Politico, New York, and you cover this state closely, and New York really had quite a presence at this convention.
We did. Of course, New York is a large delegation. It's an important Democratic constituency. And even though we're not a swing state, obviously, though Republicans say they're going to be competitive here, I don't really agree with that. New York is always important as a media capital, as a financial capital, and a capital of political donations. So we saw almost a dozen New Yorkers featured on the stage at various points during the convention. Senators Kirsten Gillibrand and Chuck Schumer both addressed the full delegation. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio spoke on Wednesday night at about 5:30, not really a great speaking slot. And then, of course, Governor Andrew Cuomo spoke on Thursday, about 3 hours ahead of Secretary Clinton, giving a speech that evoked his late father, Mario Cuomo, and the address Mario Cuomo gave to the 1984 Democratic Convention in San Francisco.
I want to talk about Andrew Cuomo and Bill de Blasio and that dynamic in a moment. But back to something you just said. You don't see New York being in play in November. We have New York versus New York, Brooklyn versus Fifth Avenue.
That's right. You know, the demographics do not favor Republicans in the state of New York. And if you look at some recent polling data, they show Secretary Clinton with a strong lead here over Donald Trump. Granted, she's not as popular a figure as Barack Obama was. She might be lagging other Democratic nominees in the state, but she has a solid lead. And when I think about this, Steve, I think back to 2010 in the gubernatorial election. Carl Palladino, the Buffalo developer, really built a populist conservative wave, and that was his base. It rocketed him to success in the Republican primaries of that year. He bested Rick Lazio, the former congressman from Long Island. But in the general election, Palladino didn't crack 35% of the electorate. If you think about New York, there are twice as many enrolled Democrats as Republicans. If you think about the demographics of New York, racial minorities account for between, I think, 40 to 50% of the state's population. We know from polling and we know from the explicit messaging that these groups are not backing Donald Trump. So I think that while Trump will do well in upstate New York, I think that Trump will appeal to working class white voters, most of whom live in upstate New York, but some of whom live on Long Island as well, that we're going to see really be coming to the fore in places like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, even Michigan. But in New York, the demographics of the state are not such that that is enough to carry you to victory. When you couple that with the fact that basically the entire structure of political power in this state leads toward the Democrats, I think that Donald Trump is going to have a very hard time. And I know that his people are saying they're going to compete here. I don't believe that they will have a good chance. But you know, things could change between now and Election Day.
Now, Andrew Cuomo, he actually spoke twice at the convention. Are there bigger things down the line for him? This really seems to be kind of a stage setter for Andrew Cuomo. He was featured. I mean, it's not like the convention was in New York. It wasn't his home state.
No, and he said that it was a sign of respect that the New York governor would be invited to address the convention on the last night. He really, my big takeaway from his speech was not perhaps a launching of a national platform for Governor Cuomo. I honestly think that that time may have come and gone. He may have been a potential candidate in 2016. Of course, he was not a candidate this year. That never came to pass, and I think that he didn't sense it would be time for him to be a candidate in 2016, knowing that Hillary Clinton would be rising. But what he did in his speech was try to harmonize the message of his father in 1984, which one longtime observer of New York politics, former Assemblyman Richard Brodsky, told me created a spiritual case for the principles of the Democratic Party, this being Mario's 1984 address. And I think Andrew Cuomo tried to harmonize that message with the current election. I thought he did that well. He presented it as a case for unity over fear. He said that fear has never given anyone a job. Fear has never built a school. Fear has never educated a child. That, to me, was the most memorable cadence within the 15-minute address that Andrew Cuomo gave tonight. Harmonizing that with Mario Cuomo's address, but then also trying to shoehorn in his own accomplishments. Because Andrew Cuomo is not known as someone who speaks in lofty, partisan, striving, idealistic tones. He's a pragmatic governor. He said explicitly that he believes government should be about achieving results. It should not be a debating society. And so I think that it was not, it could have been smoother. I don't think it was awkward, but it could have been smoother to work in his own accomplishments as governor, passing a $15 minimum wage, enacting a system of paid family leave, signing into law legislation in 2011 that guaranteed same-sex marriage rights for gays, passing a gun control bill in 2013. I think that it was a good speech. I felt that it could have perhaps addressed those accomplishments and weaved them in a little bit more seamlessly, but he, I thought, set himself up in a good place. He certainly was received warmly by the New York delegation. I think some of the other delegates were listening, but I don't know that this is going to set him up for some sort of larger step onto the national stage.
We are talking with Jimmy Vielkind, Albany Bureau Chief from Politico, New York, and we do welcome your questions. If you're watching, like to send a question our way, go ahead and fire away on that. Jimmy, I want to talk about the Cuomo de Blasio feud, the dynamic between them. After seeing what happened in Philadelphia, it appears to be advantage Cuomo.
It's advantage Cuomo. I don't think this was a good week for the mayor. But what was striking to me was how apparent their feud was, in the city of brotherly love. So, as I said before, the state party in New York is really Andrew Cuomo's baby. He sets the tone. He appoints the chair. He is essentially directing the staff of the organization. And it really didn't feel like a welcome space for de Blasio at all. So when Andrew Cuomo on Tuesday morning, brought Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders to the delegation breakfast and stood with him as his Sanders supporters cheered, Mayor de Blasio was nowhere to be found. On Tuesday evening, when New York's delegation announced its tally, and as the cameras rolled, Mayor de Blasio was kind of out of the shot, and there even were some people holding signs that might have, covered up his face. And then on Thursday, when Mayor de Blasio was scheduled to address the New York delegation, Governor Andrew Cuomo spoke for 24 minutes. They played a tribute to Governor Mario Cuomo, and de Blasio ended up walking out without addressing the delegates because he had a previous commitment.
Well, that's what his people said. He was late for a panel. Do you buy that, or had he just had enough and wanted to get out?
I think it's a combination of both. If you know someone has a time constraint, you would accommodate them, right? So if the answer to Governor Cuomo and his aides had been, hey, I've got to bug out by 10 o'clock, if I could speak before the governor, or if we could rearrange these awards so that I can go, that should have been able to be worked out, but it wasn't. And I think that speaks real volumes about the man. I actually was able to speak with Mayor de Blasio at the course of the convention. I asked him about what was he doing here, because remember that Mayor de Blasio entered this week's confab as sort of a man without a country. Many of his staunch allies, including the Working Families Party, backed Bernie Sanders. And if you think about the progressive city councilman, the public advocate that Bill de Blasio was, I think it's very easy to have seen him as perhaps being a supporter of Senator Sanders. He eventually endorsed Hillary Clinton, but he waited. He wanted to make himself sort of a good housekeeping stamp of approval for what it means to be a progressive Democrat in the country. He planned an Iowa forum, which was eventually canceled. He started a national group. And I think as a result, the Clinton people, no doubt with the encouragement of Governor Cuomo, who served Bill Clinton as the HUD secretary in the 1990s, they sort of kept de Blasio at arm's length. So while he was at the convention, he was sort of left to pursue a separate lane, or a separate track, if you will. And what he told me was that he was trying to work with institutions that he believes will, after Election Day, try to take on and take up the mantle and continue the progressive organizing and the progressive energy that Senator Sanders' campaign has harnessed. So I don't think that the mayor had a very good week. I thought that his speaking slot was not great. I thought that his speech was fairly generic. I thought that Cuomo did a great job of sort of elbowing him off the stage and making clear, as politicians can, that the mayor didn't have any oxygen within his own delegation. And as a result, the mayor was there. He spent 4 days in Philadelphia with his wife, Shirlane McRae. And I think that he'll walk away from that with some good feelings on some groups that, if Secretary Clinton is elected president, will probably not be mainstream parts of either the Democratic Party or the government.
I don't want to stray too far away from the convention, but is Bill de Blasio in trouble next year? I mean, there's talk of Cuomo pal Ruben Diaz Jr. of the Bronx maybe challenging him in the primary.
There was a report in the Wall Street Journal that Ruben Diaz Jr. and Scott Stringer, the city comptroller, actually met in Philadelphia and sort of talked turkey about a de Blasio challenge. you know, one thing I was watching for this week were pretenders to the throne, be they if Andrew Cuomo decides not to seek election in 2018. He says he will, but we'll see what happens when things get closer. Or Mayor de Blasio, who is actively campaigning for a second term in 2017. We saw Scott Stringer, Ruben Diaz Jr., we saw Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, U.S. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. Basically, everybody is in town for these conventions. And, you know, I talked to Ruben Diaz Jr. and Scott Stringer, and Ruben Diaz Jr., I think of him as Rubencito, which is kind of his fun nickname. His father is a state senator, Ruben Diaz Sr. But what Rubencito said was that, you know, he's just kind of going with the flow and meeting people and doing events. So I think it's no secret, given the relationship between the governor and the mayor, that Andrew Cuomo would do nothing to discourage powerful institutions or powerful donors should they line up against Bill de Blasio. What I think has to happen is some type of consensus among the upwardly aspirational Democrats as to who's going to run. And if a candidate does emerge in the coming weeks, months, I don't think we have a year, but so I guess the coming weeks and months, what will they be able to draw on that support? You can't beat someone with no one, and I think that right now that is Mayor de Blasio's greatest asset.
But isn't it bad form to challenge a sitting mayor from within his own party?
It is bad form, but this is politics, right? It's about power, and you know, if you think you can be mayor, who wouldn't let that ambition or that drive or that belief that perhaps you could do a better job than the current occupant? Why not?
You were at the New York breakfasts every day. You watched the dynamics there. Of course, you were on the floor watching there. For New York State, winners and losers coming out of this. I mean, there's a lot of high-profile people who had a chance to appear. Some, as we talked about, didn't always have the best slots. Winners and losers.
I think that State Senator Adriano Espaillat gave a very good speech to the convention. On the first night, he stood with about 50 New York officials, and he said that he was once an undocumented immigrant, and he's in all likelihood going to be elected to the United States Congress. And he looked at the microphone and he said, "Take that, Donald Trump." So Senator Espaillat, of course, is the first Dominican-American elected to a state legislature, and he represents Washington Heights. He is expected to succeed Charlie Rangel. He won a pretty closely fought Democratic primary, and you know, I don't know if there's a real Republican challenger in the general election. So I think he comes out looking good, looking like a winner. I thought that Andrew Cuomo did a good job. He mingled, he reestablished himself as a friend of the Clintons. He gave a solid speech. And he made no mistakes. So I think that we can't describe him as anything other than a winner this week. I thought Mayor de Blasio came across looking like someone who could get bullied by Governor Cuomo. I think that he was dogged by sort of some scandals back home. There's a lot going on about the deal by which a nursing home on the Lower East Side was converted. That sort of broke this week. And if you looked at the tabloids all week while the mayor was in Philadelphia, it was scandal, scandal, fight, fight, disclosure, disclosure. So I don't think we can say that he walked out of here a winner. As for the rest of the New York crew, it's hard to pick any explicit losers. I think one might be, and this is sort of a more nuanced and complicated question, Senate Democratic leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins. Of course, Democrats are hoping to retake the state Senate this year, and they're hoping that, as was the case in previous presidential election cycles, that they will do well, particularly in places like Long Island, where there are lots of Republicans, where all 8 of 9 senators are Republicans, but the Democrats believe they have a chance. They're hoping that Hillary Clinton at the top of the ticket will bring a turnout surge that could help them take 1 or 2 seats, and as a result, perhaps retake the majority in the chamber. She got support from every elected official up and down the state, Senator Chuck Schumer, Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, de Blasio, of course, but not Governor Cuomo. Governor Cuomo has worked well with Senate Republicans, and he sort of explicitly said that he was agnostic, he supports Democrats, but that he would not be actively campaigning. And, you know, there might have been a thought that this would change that, this week would change that, but no dice.
Let's put a bow on the convention and wrap it all up. Was it a good week for Philadelphia? Did the city do well? Did the Democrats do well?
I think it was a great week for Philadelphia. I've been to Philadelphia before, but just as a visitor, struck by how it was nice. The police were all friendly. Things seemed to be well managed. And you know, I think that the city of Philadelphia walks away from this doing just fine. As for the Democrats, we're going to wait and see whether or not Hillary Clinton gets a post-convention poll bump, the way that Donald Trump did after the Republicans convened last week in Cleveland. But I think that the Democratic Party went a long way this year with the way that, from where I sit, this week with the way supporters of Senator Bernie Sanders were able to blow off some steam, the way they were given oxygen during the roll call vote to show their strength, the way Senator Sanders addressed the convention on Monday night, and then went making the rounds to try and urge his supporters that, hey, it's time. I think that there was some catharsis there, and while there will be delegates who are Bernie or bust and who will continue to sort of go their own way, I think what we saw in New York with many of the Sanders supporters will play out in other corners of our nation. So I think the Democrats walk away with no major bumps that addressed or hit Hillary Clinton. You know, Debbie Wasserman Schultz will be sort of, you know, swept aside for, you know, she's a big loser this week. Not a New Yorker, but certainly the big loser of the week. And I think that Hillary Clinton was able to get a fairly seamless media moment a few times this week.
Jimmy Vielkind, Albany Bureau Chief at Politico New York, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Steve. Always a pleasure.
And we'd like to thank everybody for watching this Facebook Live chat with Jimmy. We appreciate it. Thanks for sending in your questions, and have a good day.